I don't have a dad, but if I did, I think he would look like you." The billionaire stopped walking, stunned by the small voice that had just pierced through the noise of Fifth Avenue. Daniel Whitmore had built a life where nothing surprised him anymore. At 42 years old, he was the kind of man newspapers called untouchable. CEO of Whitmore Capital, owner of glass towers that reflected the Manhattan skyline for miles, a man whose black Rolls-Royce waited at the curb every morning at exactly 8:10 a.m. His world ran on precision numbers and quiet authority. Children did not exist in that world. Neither did interruptions. Yet somehow on that brisk October morning, with the wind slipping between skyscrapers and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a street cart, a little girl had stepped directly into his path. She couldn't have been older than 8. Thin sneakers, faded blue hoodie 2 sizes too big, light brown hair tied into a crooked ponytail that had clearly been done without a mirror. She stood barely 4 feet tall, looking up at a man who seemed like a giant made of steel and tailored wool. Around them, Manhattan rushed forward at full speed. Businessmen marched across crosswalks. Taxi horns blared. Screens on nearby buildings flashed stock prices that Daniel himself had the power to move. But for a moment, everything around him blurred. The girl's eyes were the only thing that stayed sharp. Clear gray eyes that held a strange mix of courage and hesitation. Daniel lowered the phone he had been speaking into only seconds earlier. No one spoke to him like that. Not investors, not politicians. Certainly not strangers on the sidewalk. Yet the girl didn't look afraid. She looked hopeful, like someone who had already decided this was her only chance. She took one small step closer, clutching the strap of a worn backpack that hung against her shoulder, and her voice softened into something almost careful. "I'm sorry, mister, but you look like the kind of dad who keeps promises." Daniel Whitmore stared down at the little girl, as if the world had suddenly shifted beneath his polished shoes. People on Fifth Avenue brushed past them in hurried waves, coats fluttering in the October wind, coffee cups, in handphones pressed to their ears, yet the moment felt strangely still. The girl's words hung in the air longer than they should have. A dad who keeps promises. No one had described him that way in a very long time. Daniel slowly straightened his posture, the gray wool of his tailored overcoat catching the morning sunlight. His assistant's voice was still faintly echoing from the phone in his hand, asking about a board meeting scheduled in less than 20 minutes. But he had completely forgotten the conversation. His attention stayed fixed on the small figure standing in front of him. Up close, he noticed the details most people would miss. The frayed edges of the backpack strap she was gripping tightly. The slightly scuffed sneakers that looked like they had walked more miles than any child should. The way she kept shifting her weight from one foot to the other, as if she was ready to run the moment he told her to leave. Yet her eyes never dropped. Those clear gray eyes held a quiet determination that made Daniel pause longer than he intended. He cleared his throat gently, his voice calm but firm, the same tone he used in boardrooms with men twice his size. "What is your name, kid?" The girl blinked once, almost surprised that he had answered at all. Then she stood a little straighter and spoke with careful politeness. "My name is Emily Carter, sir." She hesitated for half a second before adding the next sentence, her fingers tightening around the backpack strap. "I know you are busy. I just thought maybe if I asked nicely, you might say yes." Around them, the city roared forward, but Emily Carter waited like the entire world depended on what Daniel Whitmore would say next. Daniel Whitmore studied the girl in silence for a few seconds, that somehow felt much longer. Emily Carter. The name sounded ordinary, almost fragile against the towering glass buildings surrounding them. Daniel had spent most of his life dealing with powerful people whose names appeared in financial headlines and corporate reports. Yet somehow this small voice saying a simple name carried more weight than any business introduction he had heard in years. A gust of wind swept through the avenue, rustling the leaves of the decorative trees planted along the sidewalk. Emily pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, still waiting patiently, as if she understood that interrupting the moment might ruin her only chance. Daniel glanced briefly toward the black Rolls-Royce parked at the curb. His driver stood beside the open rear door, pretending not to watch, but clearly aware that something unusual was happening. Daniel rarely paused outside the building. His schedule moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every minute of his morning had already been accounted for. Yet he found himself standing there looking at a child who had somehow stepped through the invisible walls he kept around his life. Why would you ask something like that from a stranger? Daniel finally said, his voice calm but curious. Emily lowered her eyes for the first time, scuffing the toe of her sneaker lightly against the sidewalk. For a moment it looked like she might change her mind and walk away. Instead, she took a quiet breath and spoke honestly. Because strangers sometimes listen when nobody else does. Daniel felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. It was not pity. It was not annoyance. It was something more complicated. Something he had not felt in a long time. Emily looked back up at him then, and her next words came out soft, but steady. I only wanted to know what it feels like to spend one day with a dad. Daniel Whitmore did not answer right away. The city moved around them in a restless current of footsteps, engines, and distant sirens, but the small space between him and Emily Carter felt strangely quiet. Her words lingered in his mind longer than they should have. One day with a dad. It was such a simple request, yet it carried a weight Daniel could not ignore. He slowly slipped his phone into the inside pocket of his overcoat, something he rarely did during business hours. Emily watched the motion carefully, as if it meant something important. Daniel glanced down the avenue again, instinctively calculating the time he was already losing. The board meeting upstairs would begin in less than 15 minutes. Investors from Chicago had flown in overnight. His calendar had been planned 3 months in advance. None of those things had ever been interrupted by a child before. He looked back at Emily, noticing how she stood perfectly still, now waiting without pressure. There was no begging in her posture, only a quiet patience that felt oddly mature for someone so small. Daniel exhaled slowly. Emily, he said, choosing his words carefully, people do not usually ask strangers for something like that. Emily nodded slightly, as if she had expected the answer. I know, she said softly. That is why I asked someone who looks important. Daniel raised an eyebrow at that. Important. Most people used words like powerful, wealthy, intimidating. Important sounded different. Why does that matter? He asked. Emily hesitated for a moment, then spoke with the same honest tone she had used from the beginning. Because important people make decisions. Daniel could not help the faintest trace of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. The logic was surprisingly solid. A cold breeze swept across the sidewalk again, and Emily pulled her oversized hoodie a little tighter around her shoulders. Daniel noticed it immediately. October in Manhattan could drop below 50 degrees by mid-morning. The child was clearly not dressed for the weather. He studied her again, this time with more attention than before. The worn backpack, the careful way she chose each word, the quiet hope she was trying very hard not to show too much of. For the first time that morning, Daniel Whitmore realized something unusual. Emily Carter had not asked him for money. She had asked him for time. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for a moment longer, studying the small girl standing in front of him, as if she had just presented the most unusual business proposal he had ever heard. In the corporate world, people constantly asked him for things. Investors wanted capital. Partners wanted influence. Competitors wanted favors they would never admit they needed. But no one had ever asked him for time the way Emily Carter just had. Not politely. Not sincerely. Not with those clear gray eyes that seemed to believe the answer might actually be yes. Daniel shifted his weight slightly and glanced once more toward the entrance of Whitmore Tower, rising above them like a wall of glass and steel. 48 floors of decisions, contracts, and negotiations waited inside that building. A boardroom filled with executives was expecting him in less than 10 minutes. Yet standing here on the sidewalk, those things suddenly felt distant. Emily followed his gaze up the tower and then looked back at him. "That is your building, right?" she asked carefully. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, it is." Emily seemed impressed, though she tried not to show it too much. "It is really tall," she said quietly. Daniel almost smiled again. The observation was simple but honest in the way only a child could be. After a brief pause, Emily added something else, her voice softer now. "My mom used to say tall buildings mean someone worked very hard." The mention of her mother made Daniel pay closer attention. "And where is your mother now?" he asked gently. Emily looked down at the sidewalk for a second, tracing a small circle with the tip of her sneaker before answering. "She is not here anymore." The words were calm, but there was a quiet weight behind them. Daniel understood what the sentence meant without needing more explanation. The morning wind carried the distant smell of coffee from a nearby cafe. Emily lifted her head again and gave him a small, brave smile, the kind children use when they do not want adults to worry. "That is why I thought maybe I could borrow a dad for one day. Not forever. Just today." Daniel Whitmore felt something shift deep inside his chest, something he had spent many years learning how to ignore. Daniel Whitmore had spent most of his adult life mastering the art of emotional distance. It was a skill that served him well in boardrooms and negotiations, where hesitation could cost millions of dollars. Feelings complicated decisions, and Daniel preferred decisions that were precise and controlled. Yet standing on that Manhattan sidewalk, looking at Emily Carter's small, hopeful face, he felt that carefully built distance beginning to weaken. The morning wind swept through the avenue again, fluttering the hem of his overcoat, while Emily tucked her hands into the sleeves of her oversized hoodie for warmth. Daniel noticed the gesture immediately. The temperature had dropped to the low 50s, and she was clearly trying not to shiver. His driver, Marcus, still stood beside the open Rolls-Royce door, glancing discreetly toward them, as if waiting for instructions. Normally, Daniel would already be inside the car by now, reviewing documents on his tablet, before heading into the building. Instead, he remained exactly where he was. Emily shifted her backpack slightly on her shoulder, the worn fabric creasing under the weight of whatever small belongings she carried. She seemed ready to accept whatever answer came next. Daniel studied her again, noticing the quiet courage it must have taken for a child to approach a stranger like this. Most children her age would have been nervous, even asking for directions. Emily had asked for something far more unusual. "Why me?" Daniel finally asked, his voice calm but genuinely curious. "Out of everyone in this city, why did you choose me?" Emily glanced briefly at the tall glass tower behind him before answering. "Because you stopped walking," Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Emily gave a small shrug. "When people hurry past kids like me, they do not even look down. But when I said hello, you stopped. Even if it was only for a second. That means you listen." The answer landed with unexpected weight. Daniel had not realized that such a small action could matter so much. He looked down at the girl again, seeing her differently now. Not as an interruption, but as someone who had noticed something about him that most adults never did. Emily then added one more sentence quietly, almost like she was explaining the final piece of her reasoning. "And dads are supposed to listen." Daniel Whitmore stood there in silence, realizing that the most difficult decisions were sometimes the ones that had nothing to do with money. Daniel Whitmore slowly folded his arms as he looked down at Emily Carter, the quiet logic of her words echoing in his mind. All around them, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Yellow taxis rushed past the intersection. A delivery truck rumbled by carrying crates of produce toward a nearby restaurant. Somewhere down the block, a street vendor called out the price of hot pretzels. New York never slowed down for anyone, especially not for a billionaire with a full schedule. Yet Daniel remained standing on the sidewalk facing a child who had just challenged something he had not questioned in years. Emily waited patiently, the way someone waits for a final verdict. Her shoulders were small beneath the loose hoodie, but her posture carried a surprising steadiness. She was not begging. She was simply hoping. Daniel finally glanced toward his watch. The polished silver hands told him it was now 8:22 in the morning. His board meeting had already started without him. Somewhere 40 floors above a conference room full of executives was probably exchanging confused looks, while his assistant tried to explain his absence. Normally, that situation would have bothered him immediately. Today, for some reason, it did not. Daniel looked back at Emily and spoke carefully. Spending a day with someone is not a small thing, Emily. People have responsibilities. Emily nodded quickly, as if she understood that very well. I know, she said. That is why I only asked for today. She hesitated before continuing. Tomorrow, you can go back to being busy again. Daniel felt a faint pull at the corner of his expression, almost like the beginning of a smile that he quickly hid. Her honesty was disarming. Before he could respond, the wind swept stronger down the avenue, making Emily shiver slightly this time, despite her effort to hide it. Daniel noticed immediately. He also noticed something else now that he was paying closer attention. Emily had been standing on this corner for quite a while. Her sneakers were dusty from walking, and the backpack she carried looked heavier than something meant for a short trip. Daniel leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. Emily, where were you before you came here this morning? The girl looked toward the far end of the street for a moment before answering. I walked from 37th Street. Daniel paused. That was nearly 2 miles away. You walked that far alone? He asked quietly. Emily nodded again, her gray eyes steady as ever. I had to make sure I asked the right dad. Daniel Whitmore felt the weight of Emily Carter's answer settle quietly in his mind. Nearly 2 miles, for an 8-year-old child, that was a long walk through busy Manhattan streets filled with crowds, traffic lights, and endless noise. Yet Emily spoke about it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Daniel studied her face again, trying to understand the determination behind those calm gray eyes. Most children would have given up long before reaching this corner. Emily had clearly planned this moment with more care than he first realized. Why 37th Street? Daniel asked gently. Emily adjusted the strap of her backpack before answering. That is where the shelter is, she said. The word was spoken simply, but Daniel immediately understood the meaning behind it. A temporary place. A place where people stayed when they did not have anywhere else to go. Emily continued quietly, as if explaining something she had already thought about many times. They tell us we should stay inside during the day unless we have school or an appointment. But today I had something important to do. Daniel felt the faint tightening of his chest again. Important. The same word she had used earlier. He glanced briefly down the avenue, noticing the long stretch of sidewalks Emily must have crossed to reach this building. 2 miles through a city that rarely slowed down for anyone. You walked here by yourself this morning, he said. Emily nodded once. I left early so I would not miss you. Daniel looked at her more carefully now, piecing together the quiet clues. She had not simply wandered here by chance. She had come looking for him specifically. How did you know I would be here, Emily? Emily hesitated for a moment before giving a small, slightly proud smile. I asked people at the coffee cart across the street. They said the man in the black car comes every morning around 8:10. Daniel turned his head slowly toward the curb where his Rolls-Royce still waited. Marcus standing beside it with patient professionalism. The routine had been so consistent that even strangers had noticed it. When Daniel looked back at Emily, she spoke again in the same gentle voice. I watched yesterday from the bench near the subway entrance. You looked busy, but not angry. That is why I came back today. Daniel Whitmore realized that the child standing in front of him had spent 2 days studying a man the world believed was impossible to approach. Daniel Whitmore looked down at Emily Carter with a silence that stretched longer than any boardroom negotiation he had ever faced. The story she had just told was simple, yet every detail carried a quiet determination that unsettled him in a way he did not expect. This was not a child who had wandered here by accident. She had planned this moment carefully, watching, asking questions, walking nearly 2 miles through the city, just to stand in front of him for a chance at one answer. Around them, the rhythm of Manhattan continued without pause. Office workers rushed through revolving doors. A delivery cyclist glided between taxis. Somewhere, a subway train roared beneath the pavement. Yet Daniel felt as if the world had slowed slightly inside the small circle where he and Emily stood. He studied the girl again, noticing how she kept her shoulders straight, even though the morning air had grown colder. She had come prepared for disappointment, yet she still waited with quiet patience. That kind of patience was something Daniel rarely saw even among adults. Most people demanded immediate answers. Emily simply hoped. Daniel glanced again toward Whitmore Tower rising behind him. The glass surface reflected the pale autumn sky like a mirror of cold ambition. He had built that tower through years of relentless focus, long nights, and decisions that left no room for distractions. His life had become a system of efficiency, where every hour served a clear purpose. A spontaneous request from a child did not belong anywhere inside that system. Yet as he looked back at Emily, Daniel realized something uncomfortable. For the first time in years, the schedule in his mind no longer felt like the most important thing in front of him. Emily shifted slightly on her feet, sensing the weight of his silence but refusing to interrupt it. After a few more seconds, she spoke carefully. "If the answer is no, I understand. I know grown-ups are busy." Daniel noticed that she had chosen her words very gently, almost as if she was trying to protect him from feeling guilty. That small act of consideration made the moment even harder to ignore. "Why today?" Emily Daniel asked quietly. "Why did it have to be today?" Emily looked down at her hands for a moment before answering. "Because today is my birthday." The words were soft, almost lost beneath the distant sound of traffic. Daniel felt something inside his chest shift sharply. 8 years old, he said. Emily nodded. "I thought maybe if I had one day with a dad, I would remember it forever." Daniel Whitmore stood completely still as the meaning of that sentence settled around him like the cold October wind. For the first time that morning, the billionaire realized that the decision he was about to make had nothing to do with business power or success. It was about whether a child's 8th birthday would become a memory of hope or just another quiet day forgotten by the city. Daniel Whitmore remained motionless for several seconds after Emily Carter quietly revealed that it was her birthday. The city continued moving around them with the same restless energy, but the meaning of her words seemed to slow everything inside his mind. 8 years old, such a small number, yet it carried the weight of an entire childhood still unfolding. Daniel looked at her more carefully now, as if the moment had quietly changed the way he saw her. Emily stood with her hands tucked halfway inside the sleeves of her oversized hoodie, trying to stay warm, while pretending that the answer she was waiting for did not matter too much. But Daniel could see the truth in her eyes. This day mattered more than she was willing to admit out loud. A group of office workers passed by them laughing about something on a phone screen, completely unaware that a small turning point in 2 lives was quietly hanging in the cold morning air. Daniel glanced briefly toward the entrance of Whitmore Tower again. Through the glass doors, he could see the marble lobby and the polished reception desk, where his assistant was probably already explaining to a room full of executives why the CEO had not yet appeared upstairs. Normally, that thought would have pulled him back into his routine immediately. His life had always been built around control, around the idea that every minute should serve a purpose. Yet today, a single unexpected conversation had broken through that structure with surprising ease. Daniel looked down at Emily again and asked softly, "Did anyone at the shelter know you were coming here this morning?" Emily shook her head gently. They think I am at the library program today, she answered honestly. Daniel frowned slightly, not out of anger but concern. That means someone will probably notice when you do not come back right away. Emily nodded again, accepting the point. I will go back later. I promised I would not miss dinner time. The calm responsibility in her voice made Daniel pause again. She spoke like someone who had learned to take care of her own schedule because no one else could do it for her. After a moment, Emily looked up at him with a small, hopeful smile. If you are too busy, that is okay. Maybe next year I can try again. Daniel felt the quiet sincerity of that sentence settle deep inside him. The idea that a child would plan an entire year around the hope of asking a stranger the same question again was something he could not easily ignore. He took a slow breath, feeling the cold October air fill his lungs as the decision forming in his mind finally began to take shape. Daniel Whitmore slowly exhaled as the weight of Emily Carter's quiet hope settled deeper into his thoughts. For years he had built a life where decisions were made quickly, efficiently, often within seconds. Numbers were clear, contracts were clear, profit and loss were clear. But this moment standing on a Manhattan sidewalk with an 8-year-old girl was something entirely different. There were no spreadsheets for this kind of choice. Emily waited in the same patient silence she had shown from the beginning, her small hands still tucked halfway into the sleeves of her oversized hoodie. The wind shifted again between the tall buildings, carrying the distant smell of coffee and fresh bagels from a corner cafe. Daniel noticed Emily glance briefly in that direction before she looked back at him quickly, pretending she had not been distracted. It was a tiny moment, but Daniel understood it immediately. She was hungry. He studied her again with the careful attention of someone used to noticing small details. The worn sneakers, the backpack that looked heavier than it should for a child her age, the calm way she spoke about walking 2 miles through the city before most people had even finished their first cup of coffee. Emily Carter had clearly learned to handle difficult mornings without expecting help. Daniel shifted slightly and turned his head toward the curb where the black Rolls-Royce still waited. Marcus. His driver of nearly 10 years stood beside the door with the steady patience of someone who understood that unusual situations sometimes required quiet observation. Marcus did not ask questions. He simply waited for instructions. Daniel looked back at Emily again, his voice lower now but warmer than before. When was the last time you had breakfast, Emily? Emily blinked once at the unexpected question. Her answer came with the same honesty she had shown from the beginning. Yesterday afternoon at the shelter, she said. They give dinner around 5 o'clock. Daniel felt a quiet tightening in his chest. That meant she had walked nearly 2 miles this morning on an empty stomach. Emily noticed his expression and quickly added something else as if she wanted to reassure him. It is okay. I am used to waiting until lunchtime sometimes. Daniel Whitmore had spent decades building an empire worth billions of dollars. Yet in that moment, the most important number in his mind was the number of hours a child had gone without food. He looked at Emily for another second, before finally speaking again. Emily, he said calmly, I think the first thing we should do on your birthday is get you some breakfast. Emily Carter blinked again, as if she was not entirely sure she had heard Daniel Whitmore correctly. The words breakfast and birthday did not usually appear in the same sentence for her. For a brief second, the careful calm she had been holding all morning slipped, and a small flash of surprise appeared across her face. Daniel noticed it immediately. He also noticed something else that made the decision inside him settle more firmly. Emily had not asked for food. She had asked for time. That difference mattered more than she probably realized. The wind moved softly down the avenue again as the city carried on with its endless rhythm. A bus stopped at the corner, releasing a wave of commuters onto the sidewalk. Somewhere behind them, a taxi driver leaned on his horn. Yet the small moment between the billionaire and the 8-year-old girl remained strangely quiet. Emily looked toward the cafe Daniel had glanced at earlier, and then quickly looked back at him, as if she was worried she might appear too eager. "Are you serious?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, I am serious. It is your birthday after all." Emily shifted the strap of her backpack again, her fingers tightening around the worn fabric while she tried to process what was happening. Most adults had spent her entire life telling her what she could not do, where she could not go, and what rules she needed to follow. Very few had simply invited her somewhere. Daniel turned slightly and gestured toward the curb where the black Rolls-Royce waited. Marcus immediately stepped forward and opened the rear door with quiet professionalism. Emily's gray eyes widened slightly at the sight of the long, polished car. She had clearly seen vehicles like this in movies or on television, but standing next to one felt entirely different. Daniel noticed her hesitation and spoke in a calm, reassuring tone. "It is just a car, Emily. It gets people from one place to another like any other car." Emily gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if she accepted that explanation, even though she was not completely convinced. She took a careful step toward the vehicle, then stopped and looked back up at Daniel with the same honesty she had shown from the beginning. "Does this mean you are saying yes about today?" Daniel paused for half a second, realizing that this small question carried the true meaning of everything that had happened that morning. Then he gave a simple answer that would quietly change the course of the day for both of them. "Emily," he said gently, "I believe birthdays should be spent with someone who listens. Today, I will listen." Emily Carter climbed carefully into the back seat of the black Rolls-Royce, as if she were stepping into a completely different world. The leather seats were smooth and warm, the interior quiet enough that the noise of Manhattan traffic faded into a distant murmur once the door gently closed. For a moment, she sat very still, looking around with wide gray eyes that tried to take in every detail without appearing overwhelmed. Daniel Whitmore entered from the other side and settled beside her, giving Marcus a small nod through the partition window. The car eased away from the curb with a smooth motion that felt almost silent compared to the chaotic streets outside. Emily pressed her small hands together in her lap as she looked out the window. Tall buildings slid past, slowly, sunlight reflecting off glass towers that stretched high into the pale autumn sky. She had walked these streets before, but sitting inside the car made everything feel different, almost unreal. Daniel noticed how carefully she observed everything, the curiosity of a child who was trying to remember every second of a day she already knew would be important. After a few moments, Emily spoke softly. "I have never been inside a car like this before." Daniel gave a calm reply. "Most people have not." Emily looked back at him and tilted her head slightly. "It is very quiet in here." Daniel nodded. "That is intentional. The company that builds the car designs it so people can think without noise." Emily seemed to like that explanation. Thinking without noise sounded like a luxury she had never considered before. The car turned onto a broader avenue where the morning traffic moved more slowly. Daniel glanced toward her and asked gently, "Emily, what kind of breakfast do you like?" Emily hesitated for a moment, as if she was not sure what answer was acceptable. Finally, she spoke honestly. "Pancakes are my favorite." Daniel nodded once. "Pancakes it is." The car continued moving through the city while Emily kept watching the streets pass outside. After a minute, she spoke again, her voice thoughtful now. "My mom used to make pancakes on my birthday." Daniel turned his head slightly toward her, sensing the quiet change in her tone. Emily kept looking out the window as she continued speaking. She would always burn the first one because she said the pan needed practice. Daniel felt something tighten unexpectedly inside his chest as he listened. Emily then added one more sentence very softly. "This will be the first birthday without her." Daniel Whitmore did not answer immediately, after Emily Carter quietly said that this would be the first birthday without her mother. The words lingered in the quiet interior of the car, like something fragile that should not be rushed past. Outside the window, Manhattan continued to move with its usual restless energy, but inside the Rolls-Royce the silence felt softer, almost protective. Emily kept her eyes on the passing buildings, as if the city itself was helping her finish a thought she had been carrying for a long time. Daniel studied her small reflection in the window glass and felt something unfamiliar stirring inside his chest. It was a feeling he had buried many years ago, the kind of emotion that business success never had room for. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice. "Your mother sounds like someone who tried very hard to make your birthdays special." Emily nodded gently without looking away from the window. She did. Even when we did not have much money, she would always say birthdays are about memories, not presents. Daniel felt the quiet wisdom in that sentence settle into the space between them. Emily continued after a short pause, her voice soft but steady. "Last year she put a candle in a pancake and told me to make a wish before it burned out." Daniel turned slightly toward her. "What did you wish for?" Emily thought about it for a moment before answering. "I wished that we would always stay together." The honesty of that answer landed deeper than Daniel expected. He looked down briefly at his hands, remembering a different birthday many years ago. A small cake on a kitchen table, a tiny pair of hands clapping excitedly as candles flickered in the dim light. The memory arrived so suddenly that it caught him off guard. Emily noticed the change in his expression and asked quietly, "Did you ever celebrate birthdays with your daughter?" Daniel looked up at her again, surprised that she had somehow understood something he had not said aloud. For a moment he considered avoiding the question, the way he avoided most personal conversations. But something about Emily's presence made honesty feel easier. "Yes," he said softly. "I did." Emily watched him carefully, now sensing that the story behind those 3 words carried more weight than the sentence revealed. Daniel looked out the window toward the skyline, the buildings blurring slightly as the car continued through the morning traffic. "She loved pancakes too," he added quietly. Emily's gray eyes softened with gentle understanding. "Sometimes pancakes remember people," she said. Daniel Whitmore realized that the little girl sitting beside him was not only searching for a father for a day. Without realizing it, she had also opened a door to a part of his heart he had locked away for years. The car slowed as it approached a quiet corner diner tucked between 2 tall buildings, a place Daniel Whitmore had passed hundreds of times, but had never entered before. The neon sign in the window glowed softly in the cool morning light, and the smell of coffee and fresh pancakes drifted faintly through the air as Marcus pulled the car to the curb. Emily Carter leaned slightly toward the window, her eyes lighting up with a mixture of curiosity and cautious excitement. To most people, the diner would look ordinary, but to her it felt like the beginning of something special. Daniel noticed the change in her expression, and for a moment he allowed himself to see the scene through her eyes. Not through the perspective of a billionaire who could buy any restaurant in the city, but through the perspective of a child who had simply hoped for one kind moment on her birthday. Marcus stepped out and opened the door with quiet professionalism, but Daniel raised a hand gently before Emily climbed out. "Wait a moment," he said softly. Emily paused, looking back at him with patient attention. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out his phone. For several seconds, he stared at the screen, reading the growing list of missed messages and reminders from his office upstairs. Board meeting updates, questions from investors, notifications that would normally demand his immediate attention. For most of his life, he had answered every one of those messages within minutes. Today, he did something different. He pressed a single button and silenced the phone completely. Then he placed it back inside his coat and looked at Emily again. For the first time that morning, his voice carried a warmth that had been absent from his life for years. "Emily," he said gently, "today, there are no meetings." Emily blinked once in surprise. "None at all." Daniel gave a small nod. "Not today." Emily studied his face carefully, as if she wanted to be certain he truly meant it. "Why would you cancel work for me?" she asked softly. Daniel opened the car door and stepped out beside her, the cool autumn air brushing against them as the city continued its busy rhythm around the quiet diner. For a moment, he looked up at the tall skyline of Manhattan before answering. "Because sometimes a single day can matter more than an entire year of work." Emily stood beside him on the sidewalk, her small backpack resting against her shoulders as she absorbed those words. Then she looked up at him with the kind of smile that only appears when hope finally becomes real. And in that quiet moment outside the diner, Daniel Whitmore realized something he had not felt in a very long time. He was not simply giving a child one day of kindness. He was remembering how to live again. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Daniel Whitmore pushed it open, and Emily Carter stepped inside beside him. Warm air wrapped around them, immediately carrying the comforting scent of coffee maple syrup and freshly cooked pancakes. The inside of the diner felt like a different world compared to the rushing Manhattan streets outside. Sunlight filtered through the large front windows, reflecting off chrome stools and polished tabletops, while a quiet country song played from an old speaker behind the counter. A waitress in her late 50s looked up from pouring coffee and gave them a friendly smile, though her expression carried a flicker of surprise when she recognized Daniel. People in the neighborhood knew exactly who he was, even if he rarely stepped into places like this. Daniel gave a polite nod as he guided Emily toward a booth near the window. Emily slid onto the red leather seat, slowly, her gray eyes moving around the diner with careful curiosity, as if she wanted to memorize every detail. The waitress approached with 2 menus, but Emily had already placed hers flat on the table, looking up at Daniel with quiet certainty. "Pancakes," she said with a small, hopeful smile. Daniel returned the smile, something that felt more natural now than it had earlier that morning. "2 orders of pancakes, please," he told the waitress, "and a glass of milk for her." The waitress nodded warmly before walking back toward the kitchen, leaving the 2 of them in a pocket of peaceful quiet. Outside the window, yellow taxis rolled past, and pedestrians hurried down the sidewalk, but inside the booth time seemed to move more slowly. Emily rested her hands on the table and studied Daniel for a moment before speaking. "You really did stop working today," she said softly. Daniel folded his hands calmly in front of him. "Yes, I did." Emily tilted her head slightly, thinking about that answer, the way children often think about complicated things adults say. Then she asked another honest question. "Does anyone ever get upset when you do something unexpected like that?" Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. "Sometimes people do not understand choices that come from the heart instead of a schedule." Emily nodded slowly, as if that explanation made perfect sense. After a short silence, she spoke again, her voice gentle but sincere. "My mom used to say that the best dads are the ones who show up when they do not have to." Daniel Whitmore looked across the table at the little girl and realized that without even trying, Emily Carter had already given him something far more valuable than the business meeting he had canceled that morning. The waitress returned a few minutes later, carrying 2 large plates stacked with golden pancakes, steam rising gently into the warm diner air. She placed 1 plate in front of Emily Carter and another in front of Daniel Whitmore, along with a small pitcher of maple syrup and a glass of cold milk. Emily stared at the pancakes with wide gray eyes, as if the plate in front of her was something far more extraordinary than an ordinary breakfast. The pancakes were perfectly round, slightly crisp around the edges, and stacked nearly 4 inches high. For a moment, she simply looked at them without touching the fork beside her plate. Daniel noticed and asked softly, "Is something wrong?" Emily shook her head quickly. "No, nothing is wrong. I was just making sure they are real." Daniel raised an eyebrow with a faint smile. "Real pancakes?" Emily nodded seriously. "Sometimes when you want something too much, it feels like it might disappear if you move too fast." Daniel understood the meaning behind that sentence more clearly than she realized. He picked up the small pitcher and poured a thin stream of maple syrup across the top pancake, watching it slowly soak into the warm surface. Emily followed his example carefully, her movements thoughtful and almost ceremonial. After a second, she took her first bite. The moment the fork reached her mouth, her eyes brightened in a way that needed no explanation. "Good," Daniel asked gently. Emily nodded enthusiastically while finishing the bite. "Very good. Probably the best birthday pancakes ever." Daniel felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle into his chest as he watched her eat with simple joy. For years, his business success had been measured in stock prices, contracts, and the size of corporate acquisitions. Yet in that moment, the happiest result he had seen in a long time was the smile of an 8-year-old girl enjoying breakfast. After several bites, Emily slowed down and looked across the table at him again. "Thank you for saying yes today," she said sincerely. Daniel rested his fork on the edge of his plate. "You are welcome, Emily." Emily studied his face for a moment before asking something else. "Do you think people can choose to become family even if they were strangers before?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Sometimes the most important families begin with a simple act of kindness," he replied. Emily thought about that answer while taking another small bite of pancake. Then she smiled softly and said something that made Daniel pause completely. "My birthday wish might be coming true after all." Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment after Emily Carter quietly said that her birthday wish might already be coming true. The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that felt far heavier than most conversations he had experienced in years. Outside the diner window, Manhattan continued moving with its usual unstoppable rhythm: taxis sliding through intersections and pedestrians weaving between one another. But inside the small booth, the morning seemed to slow into something quieter and more meaningful. Emily took another small bite of pancake and then looked up at Daniel again, her expression thoughtful rather than excited. She was not speaking like a child chasing a fantasy. She was speaking like someone who had carefully considered what family truly meant. Daniel leaned back slightly in the booth and folded his hands together as he watched her. "Emily," he said gently, "birthday wishes can be very powerful things, but they do not always happen the way we imagine." Emily nodded as if she already understood that truth very well. "My mom used to say that too," she replied softly. "Sometimes wishes come slowly, so people have time to recognize them." Daniel studied the quiet wisdom in her voice and realized again how much life this small girl had already experienced. The waitress returned briefly to refill Daniel's coffee and smiled warmly at Emily before stepping away again. When the booth was quiet once more, Emily looked across the table and asked another careful question. "When today is over, will we go back to being strangers again?" The honesty of that question landed deeply in Daniel's chest. He could see that Emily was not asking for promises she did not deserve. She simply wanted to understand what the end of the day would mean. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment, noticing the half-finished stack of pancakes and the glass of milk Emily had nearly emptied. Then he looked back at her and answered slowly, "I do not believe kindness should have an expiration date." Emily watched him closely, trying to understand every word. Daniel continued in the same calm tone. "When we finish breakfast today, I think we should visit the shelter where you are staying." Emily blinked in surprise. "The shelter?" Daniel nodded. "I would like to speak with the people who help take care of you there." Emily's gray eyes widened slightly as she tried to understand why a man like Daniel Whitmore would want to do something like that. Daniel held her gaze and added one final sentence that quietly changed the meaning of everything that had happened that morning. "Because sometimes one day with a child is enough to realize that the story should not end when the sun goes down." The diner door chimed again as Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter stepped back onto the Manhattan sidewalk, the cool autumn air greeting them after the warmth of breakfast. Emily held the strap of her backpack with one hand, while the other rested lightly against the side of the black Rolls-Royce parked at the curb. Her expression carried a quiet mixture of happiness and disbelief, as if she was still trying to confirm that the morning had truly happened. Daniel noticed the thoughtful look on her face as Marcus opened the car door for them again. Emily glanced up at the tall buildings surrounding them and then back at Daniel. The city felt different now. The same streets that had seemed long and uncertain earlier that morning suddenly felt smaller, less intimidating. She climbed into the car once more, settling into the seat with the calm confidence of someone who had already discovered that this day would not disappear as quickly as she once feared. Daniel sat beside her as the car gently pulled away from the curb and merged into the slow river of traffic. For several moments, Emily simply watched the city through the window, while sunlight reflected across the glass towers and passing taxis. Then she turned toward Daniel with a careful expression. "Are we really going to the shelter?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, we are." Emily thought about that answer for a second before asking the question that had quietly formed in her mind since breakfast. "Are you going there because you feel sorry for me?" Daniel looked at her with calm honesty. "No, Emily. I am going because I would like to understand your life better." Emily studied his face carefully, and then gave a small nod as if she believed him completely. The car continued moving downtown, while the city passed around them in waves of sunlight and motion. And as Emily Carter watched the streets she had walked earlier that morning slowly glide by outside the window, she began to realize that the journey she had started alone before sunrise was leading somewhere she had never dared to imagine. The black Rolls-Royce slowed as it turned onto a quieter street lined with older brick buildings far from the shining towers of Midtown Manhattan. Emily Carter recognized the neighborhood immediately. The sidewalks here were familiar. The small grocery store on the corner, the faded mural on the side of a community center, and the modest building with a blue awning where the shelter operated. Her gray eyes widened slightly as the car rolled gently to a stop across the street. For a moment, she simply sat there, her small hands resting on her backpack, as if she was trying to understand how the morning had brought her back here in such a different way. Just a few hours earlier, she had walked away from this same street before sunrise, hoping that one brave question might change something in her life. Now she had returned sitting beside a man who had listened. Daniel Whitmore noticed the quiet shift in her expression. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Emily looked up at the shelter entrance where a few people moved in and out of the building, staff members starting their morning routines. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "I think so." Marcus stepped out to open the door, and the cool air of the late morning drifted inside the car again. Daniel stepped onto the sidewalk first, before offering Emily a gentle hand as she climbed out beside him. She stood there for a second, looking at the building that had been her temporary home for the past several months. Then she looked up at Daniel again, with the same thoughtful honesty that had guided her all day. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked quietly. Daniel glanced at the shelter entrance, and then back at her. "Yes, Emily. Some stories deserve more than a single chapter." Emily held his gaze for a moment, before giving a small, hopeful smile. And together they began walking toward the front door of the shelter, both of them stepping into a future that neither of them had expected when the sun first rose over Manhattan that morning. The front door of the shelter opened with a soft creak as Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter stepped inside together. The building smelled faintly of laundry soap and warm soup from the kitchen down the hall, a simple, comforting scent that spoke of people doing their best to take care of one another. A staff member behind the front desk looked up in surprise when she recognized Emily returning earlier than expected. But the real surprise appeared when her eyes moved to the tall man standing beside the little girl. Daniel greeted her politely and explained that he wanted to speak with someone about Emily's situation. While the staff member went to find the director, Emily stood quietly near the entrance, her backpack resting against her shoulders as she looked around the familiar room. Children's drawings covered one wall, bright crayon houses, and smiling stick figure families. Daniel followed her gaze and noticed something small, taped near the corner of the board. It was a drawing of a tall man holding hands with a little girl under a yellow sun. Emily saw him looking at it and gave a shy smile. "I made that last month," she said softly. Daniel studied the drawing for a moment before asking gently, "Who is the man in the picture?" Emily hesitated only a second before answering with simple honesty, "I did not know yet." Daniel felt something warm settle quietly in his chest. Just then, the shelter director approached and greeted them kindly, ready to begin a conversation that would shape the next chapter of Emily's life. But before any words were exchanged, Emily looked up at Daniel once more, her gray eyes filled with a cautious hope that had grown stronger throughout the day. She reached for his hand without thinking, her small fingers wrapping gently around his. Daniel did not pull away. Instead, he held her hand firmly, as if acknowledging a promise that had formed long before either of them realized it. And in that quiet moment inside a modest shelter far from the shining towers of Manhattan, a lonely birthday wish slowly began turning into something far greater than either of them had imagined. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our